A double role. Rampo, Edogawa. When a man grows bored, there's no telling what he might get up to. I once knew a fellow named T. He was, in the usual sense, an idler without an occupation. He wasn't particularly wealthy, but he had enough to keep himself fed. His days revolved around the piano, the gramophone, dancing, plays, the cinema, and the pleasures of the red light district. A man forever circling through such amusements. Unfortunately for him, he had a wife. And in the case of a man like that, having a wife at home is no joke, nothing short of a misfortune. Truly. Not that he disliked her, but of course T was not the sort of man to be satisfied with just his wife. He flitted from woman to woman. Naturally, his wife grew jealous, which, oddly enough, was a spice of enjoyment he found hard to forego. The fact was, T's wife was a beauty far too fine a woman for the likes of him. And yet, if he couldn't be satisfied with her, he certainly wasn't going to find any real prize among the common run of prostitutes. But there it was, boredom. He wasn't suffering from an excess of passion, nor was he looking for true love. He was simply bored. Passing from one woman to the next gave him a certain change of flavor, and perhaps, by some fluke, he might stumble upon a true treasure. That was, by and large, the meaning of T's amusements. Now, here's the story of something peculiar he began to do, and it was truly outlandish. When a pastime goes this far, it gets a touch uncanny. I'm sure everyone has felt it at some point. The curiosity to spy on one's own wife when she's in the company of another man. In other words, a lover. Of course, to have it actually happen would be unbearable. But now and then the thought alone stirs a strange sort of curiosity. I'm convinced that was the main reason behind T's bizarre scheme, though he himself claimed it was a way to blunt his wife's jealousy over his endless indulgences. So what did he do? One night, he dressed himself from head to toe in a completely new outfit he'd acquired outside, and even affixed a small false mustache under his nose. In short, a quick and simple disguise. In the sleeve of his kimono, he tucked a silver cigarette case engraved with a false set of initials, and then, affecting complete nonchalance, he returned home. T's wife, naturally enough, was certain he had come home late, as usual, from some night out. She did not suspect the slightest thing about his disguise, hardly surprising, since she had seen him only with sleepy eyes in the middle of the night. For his part, T had been careful in his preparations. The stripes of his new kimono were chosen to closely resemble one he already owned, and until he slipped into bed, he kept the false mustache hidden with his hand or a handkerchief. In short, T's peculiar little plan went off without a hitch. In bed, the couple had the habit of sleeping with the light off. In that darkness, T finally took his hand away from the mustache. As might be expected, the strange sensation of those bristles startled his wife. "Oh!" Her sweet little cry was only natural. At that instant, T faced the most delicate part of his scheme. The moment he realized she had felt the mustache, he quickly turned over, pulling the quilt around him so she could not touch it again, and began to snore loudly in feigned sleep. Had she grown suspicious and insisted on investigating, T's plan would have been completely ruined. Lying there, pretending to sleep, he was inwardly trembling, but his wife, unexpectedly easygoing, seemed to think she had simply imagined it and stayed still. Before long, T could hear her gentle breathing as she drifted into slumber. Now, the moment was his. He waited until she was sound asleep, then slipped quietly from the bed. Dressing quickly, he left only the silver cigarette case by her pillow and crept out of the house without a sound, not by the front door, but by climbing over the garden wall. At that hour, there were no carriages to be had, so he walked the 10-odd blocks to his usual tea house. A whimsical fellow, indeed. Morning came. When his wife awoke, she was more than a little shocked to find her husband, who should have been lying beside her, gone without a trace. She searched the house, but he was nowhere to be found. It was unlike her lazy husband to be out so early, and she puzzled over it. Then her eyes fell on the cigarette case by her pillow. It was a piece she had never seen before, quite unlike the one her husband always carried. She picked it up and examined it. Engraved on it were initials entirely unknown to her, and even the cigarettes inside were not her husband's usual brand. She considered the possibility that he had mistakenly taken it from someone, but something about it still felt wrong. And then she remembered the mustache from the night before. One can imagine just how much that set her heart to worrying. Then T came home, wearing a look of meek contrition, as though embarrassed at having stayed out all night. Naturally, his clothing had been changed back to what he had worn when leaving the house the previous day, and the false mustache was gone. Under ordinary circumstances, his wife would have given him quite an earful, but today she was in no mood for that. She had far greater worries on her mind. In silence, T walked into the sitting room, and his wife, pale-faced, followed after him. After a while, she ventured hesitantly, "This cigarette case, you didn't happen to swap it with someone's, did you?" Of course, she meant the silver case from the night before. "No, why do you ask?" T feigned innocence. "But," she said, with a faint touch of coyness, "didn't you bring it home last night?" "Really?" he replied, still playing the fool. "But look, my own is right here. And besides, what's this about me coming home last night?" He raised his voice slightly at that point, the better to jolt her. There's no need to transcribe their back and forth in full, like a rakugo routine, but after several such exchanges, T at last drew from her the whole account of what had happened the previous night. T then put on a face of deep puzzlement. Such a thing was absurd, impossible. Why, he'd spent the night drinking with so-and-so at such and such a place. She could ask the man herself if she liked. This was, in detective story parlance, his alibi arranged in advance, of course. "What? You think I was the one who played the stand-in?" "Oh no, not at all." "Perhaps you only dreamt it?" he suggested. "No, it was no dream. And as proof, there's the cigarette case right here." "Well now," he mused, "I've read in old books about a strange malady called detached spirit disease, in which a man's form splits in two, and each goes about a different business in a different place at the same time. But surely such things don't happen these days, unless—" he leaned in with mock suspicion. "Unless you're just saying that, and in truth, you secretly let some other man in." He delighted in such teasing. It amused him to no end. At any rate, that day passed in a haze of ambiguity. Naturally, once would not be enough. In T's plan, he intended to repeat the trick again and again. The second time, he felt a little anxious. His wife, having been put through it once before, might raise an alarm if he waltzed in wearing a disguise again. So this time, when entering the house, he wore no disguise and no mustache. After they had turned off the light and gone to bed, he waited until she was just drifting into sleep. then, in that hazy space between dreaming and waking, gave her the briefest sensation of that familiar false mustache just for an instant before letting her sink into slumber. Once certain she was fully asleep, he slipped out of bed, left behind a handkerchief with the same embroidered initials as before, and stole quietly from the house, climbing over the garden wall rather than leaving by the front door. To his satisfaction, the trick worked a second time. The following morning unfolded much like the first, except that his wife's face was paler still, and T's make-believe jealousy was played with greater force. As the third, then the fourth repetition followed, T's performance improved more and more, until his wife now regarded the man of the cigarette cases and initialed handkerchiefs as a definite, living person. And yet, at the same time, something strange began to happen. Up to this point, it had all been a sort of comic anecdote, but from here on, the tale took on a more serious shade, something that gave one pause, showing how uncertain and how strange the human heart can be. The first change arose in his wife. She, reputed for her chastity, began believing the disguised T to be another man entirely to show him certain marks of favor. It was a curious thing, though such examples are not unknown in old books. Perhaps, for her, these nightly trysts with a stranger had become a kind of fairy tale. On one hand, she now hid from her husband the tokens left by the disguised T. On the other, she began whispering words of guilt-tinged intimacy to him, consciously treating him as someone other than her husband. "I don't know who you are or why you come to me, but your kindness has become something I can no longer forget. I even feel lonely on nights when you do not appear. When will you come again?" When T realized this change of heart, though change of heart might not be quite the right term, his feelings must have been beyond description. From one angle, his original aim had been completely achieved. Now that his wife had such a glaring weakness, his own dissipation could proceed without the slightest need for guilt. His plan, as he had conceived it, called for ending the game here permanently, burying his disguised self. Since the man had never truly existed, there would be no complications afterward. But now, he found himself in a state of utter confusion he had never foreseen. That dreadful fact that even toward an imagined man, his wife had begun to feel love struck him like a blow. What had begun as mock jealousy was turning into something genuine, if such feelings could even be called jealousy. For there was no rival. Whom was he jealous of, after all? His wife had never given her body to any man but himself. His supposed rival in love was, in the end, none other than himself. Once things had reached that point, T's wife, who had never seemed especially remarkable to him before, now appeared as a woman unlike any other in the world. And when he thought of her as being stolen away by another man, though that man was, in truth, himself, his resentment was intense. If he saw her lost in a pensive daydream, he would think, "Ah, she's thinking about that other man now," and the thought became unbearable. T had, in short, trapped himself in the very snare he had set. It was useless to abruptly halt the masquerade. The damage was done. A strange reserve had crept into their marriage. His wife grew prone to melancholy. No doubt, she could not bring herself to give up the unseen man. It pained T to see this, and yet, at the same time, knowing that the man she cared for so deeply was none other than himself was not entirely displeasing. Should he confess the whole affair to her? The idea felt distasteful. Partly, The sheer foolishness of his own conduct made him feel ashamed, but more importantly, and this was the real reason he could not let go of the intoxicating thrill of that secret romance, the first he had ever experienced. In it, he felt he had discovered what true love was. To think that his wife, who, in her dealings with his ordinary self, had been no different from any other respectable housewife, should harbor such passion deep within her heart, T had been utterly unprepared for it. And the more their clandestine meetings continued, the clearer it became. How could he now admit it had all been a farce? Yet to maintain this double life forever was not only troublesome, but also carried the risk that his wife might discover the truth. Until now, they had always met late at night, under dim light or often in complete darkness, and with a solid alibi in place. But such unnatural arrangements could not go on indefinitely. There were, he saw, only 3 possible courses. First, to kill off the imaginary man. Second, to confess the whole trick. Or third, strange as it seemed, to abandon entirely the persona of T, the husband she had grown disenchanted with, and fully become the fictitious man. As I've said, having discovered in his wife, under the guise of the imaginary man, a kind of first love, T found himself unable to choose either of the first 2 paths. Difficult though it was, he resolved at last to take the third. In other words, a man named A, who had been playing a double role as A and B, would now discard A completely and transform himself wholly into B, creating a man who had never before existed in the world. Once decided, T announced a journey and stayed away from home for about a month, using the time to alter his appearance as much as possible. He changed the way his hair was cut, grew a mustache, took to wearing glasses, even underwent an operation to turn his single eyelids into doubles, and added a small scar to his face. When the mustache had grown in, he made a point of traveling all the way to Kyushu, from where he sent his wife a letter of divorce. His wife was left at a loss. She had no relatives to turn to for advice. Fortunately, her husband had left her a large sum of money, so she suffered no hardship in that regard, but she could hardly sit idle. At such a time, she must surely have thought, if only that man would come to me now. And then, right on cue, the man who was in fact T, now completely assuming the identity of the imaginary lover, appeared before her. At first, she insisted he was T, but when one of T's friends visited and could not hold a coherent conversation with him, the friend being a supporting player in T's drama, and when the man's background was brought to light, also a fabrication prepared by T, she gradually came to believe they were 2 different people entirely. Had there been any rational reason to believe such a thing, she would never have been deceived, but, apart from T's own hidden motives, there was no reason at all. No one, after all, could possibly imagine such a ridiculous charade being staged in earnest. That T's wife was taken in so easily is hardly surprising. Before long, they moved to a new address and began living together. Naturally, his name was no longer T. As a result, we friends of T were firmly barred from visiting. From what I've heard, he has since quite given up his old ways, and this farcical little drama seems to have produced unexpectedly good results. The 2 of them are said to be living together in great harmony. There are strange transformations in men, it seems. But there is still a little more to the story. Not long ago, by chance, I encountered the man who had once been T. He was accompanied by the same wife as before. Thinking it might be awkward to address him, I tried to pass by without drawing attention, but to my surprise, T himself called out my name. No need for such discretion, he said, his voice far more cheerful than I remembered. We sat down on some nearby chairs and talked for the first time in ages. You see, he said, she's known the whole trick from the very beginning. I thought I was the one pulling the wool over her eyes, but in truth, I was the one being completely deceived. It seems she realized my mischief from the start, but since it did no real harm, and if it could help keep the household peaceful, she decided to play along as though she were fooled. No wonder everything went so smoothly. Haha. Women really are mysterious creatures. At this, T's wife, still as beautiful as ever, smiled shyly. I had harbored some suspicion from the start that this might be the case, so I wasn't much surprised. But T, apparently proud of the whole matter, repeated the story several times, acting astonished at his own expense each time. Judging by their manner, they were indeed still a devoted couple. And so, quietly, I offered them my heartfelt congratulations.